They called me crazy for building this ugly stove. But when the grid went dark for 6 weeks, guess whose door they were all standing at?
They mocked the veteran for the strange contraption in his woodshed, called it ugly, called it dangerous, called him crazy. Jax Harlan said nothing. He just kept stacking dry pine, year after year, while his neighbours laughed. 12 years overseas, a wife who took everything, a country that forgot his name. All he had left was a half-acre, a wounded German shepherd named Smokey, and a strange clay and brick fire he had built with his own scarred hands. Then the storm came. 6 weeks. No power. No gas. No help. And every neighbour who had laughed found themselves standing at his door in the snow. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The November dawn arrived over the half-acre outside Cold Creek, Montana. The way grief arrives in a man's chest, slowly and from underneath, leaching the warmth out of everything it touched before the eye could even register that the dark had begun to lift. The cold inside the small one-room cabin was a deep, settled, patient cold, the kind that lived in the floorboards and the corners and the iron of the door hinges, the kind that did not retreat just because a man opened his eyes and decided to be alive for another day. Jax Harlan lay still on the narrow cot beneath 2 wool army blankets and a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke and the long, slow seasons he had spent there alone. And he listened to the cabin the way he had once listened to a forward operating base at 3 a.m, ear by ear, sound by sound, ruling the building safe before he allowed himself to move. The kettle on the small wood stove in the corner ticked softly as the iron began to lose its overnight heat. Outside, the rough timber siding creaked once, complaining about the temperature drop. A single crow called from the line of black pine that bordered the back of the property. The window above the cot was etched with a thin lace of frost that had bloomed during the night, and through that pale crystalline veil the world beyond looked drained of colour, all silver and slate and the bone white of the first hard frost of the season. Smokey lifted her noble head from the foot of the cot and studied him with those steady amber eyes that always seemed to be reading 3 things at once: the man, the room, and whatever lay beyond the walls. Her thick double coat was warm against his ankle, her great chest rising and falling with the patient discipline of a soldier who had learned long ago that there was no point in wasting energy on alarm before alarm was warranted. She did not whine, she did not nudge him. She simply waited the way she had waited on 100 mornings in 100 places, watching her man come back to himself, ready to follow him into whatever the day required. "Morning, soldier," Jax said quietly, his voice still rough from sleep, scraped clean of any softness by the cold. The dog's heavy tail thumped softly, exactly twice, against the rough wool of the quilt. He pushed himself upright and the cold met him at every seam of his union suit, sliding into his shoulders, his lower back, the long jagged scar that ran down the outside of his right thigh, and never fully forgot the desert. He sat for a moment on the edge of the cot the way an older man might, planting his feet on the cold floorboards and letting his weight settle, letting his body remember how to be a body. Then he stood, pulled on his canvas trousers, his thick wool socks, his second flannel shirt, and finally the worn military surplus jacket whose cuffs had begun fraying years ago, and which he had not yet found a reason to replace. His combat boots stood by the door, exactly where they always stood, exactly aligned, laces tucked neatly inside. He fed the small wood stove with 3 pieces of split lodgepole pine. He filled the kettle from the pitcher of water he had drawn from the hand pump the night before. He set the kettle back on the stove. He moved through these small motions without thought, because thought was a thing he had learnt to ration like clean water. And the morning routine was a discipline that built the day from underneath, one quiet, deliberate piece at a time. Smokey followed him to the door, pressed her shoulder briefly against his thigh in passing, and stepped out into the grey dawn ahead of him with the easy, controlled grace of a working dog at the start of her shift. The woodshed stood 30 feet from the cabin door, slightly downhill, its plank walls weathered to the soft grey of an old battleship, and its tin roof glinting dully under a sky the colour of pewter. Jax had built the shed himself in his second month on the property, working sometimes by daylight and sometimes by the white pool of a single lantern, hammering and sawing and notching, learning patience from the wood, learning humility from his own mistakes. The shed was 14 feet by 20, with a steeply pitched roof to shed snow, 2 small windows of salvaged glass, a stovepipe that rose 4 feet above the ridgeline and capped with a weatherproof spark arrestor, and a single heavy door that closed with a wrought iron latch that he had hammered out himself on a cold January afternoon. Above the door, in deep, unhurried letters he had burned in with a hot iron rod, were 3 words that meant nothing to anyone but him: always be ready. Inside the shed, the rocket stove waited. It was, he knew, an ugly thing in the eyes of those who did not understand it. It looked nothing like a fireplace. It looked nothing like a wood stove a man might buy in town from the catalogue at the hardware store. It was squat, asymmetrical, deliberate, and entirely the product of a soldier's mind making peace with a civilian winter. The combustion chamber was a J-shaped tunnel of high-temperature fire brick, the feed tube vertical and narrow, the burn tunnel running horizontal and short. Above the burn tunnel rose the heat riser, an insulated column wrapped in mineral wool inside a sheet metal jacket, and around that riser stood the great barrel, a 55-gallon steel drum salvaged from a defunct sawmill outside Missoula, scrubbed clean, bolted to a base, and turned upside down to capture every wasted ounce of heat. A flue elbowed off the barrel and ran horizontally for 9 feet through a long thermal mass bench. Jax had built from cob, sand, and salvaged fire brick, a low waist-high bench that ran along the wall of the shed and stayed warm for 8 hours after a single firing. The flue exited through the wall and rose up the stovepipe to the roof. The first time the building inspector had come out from town, he had stood in the open doorway of the shed for almost a full minute without speaking. His clipboard held loosely at his side, his face working through several expressions that did not arrive at any conclusion he could easily name. He had finally asked Jax what exactly he was looking at. Jax had explained briefly and quietly, the way he explained everything. The inspector had written something in his clipboard, sucked his teeth, and said something about non-standard installation. He had not condemned it. He had not approved it. He had left it in a kind of bureaucratic limbo that suited the both of them. Howard Pemberton had not been so neutral. Jax fed kindling into the feed tube and lit it with a single wooden match, shielding the small flame for a breath until it caught, and then he stepped back as the rocket stove did what the rocket stove always did. The fire pulled itself downward into the burn tunnel, as if drawn by an invisible hand, the air rushing in over the top of the kindling with a soft, hungry hiss, and within 30 seconds the chamber was roaring with a clean blue-edged flame and almost no visible smoke. He fed in 2 thicker splits of seasoned pine, then a piece of birch he had been saving, and the steel barrel began to tick quietly as it took on heat. He set the iron skillet on the cooktop ring above the riser and laid 2 strips of bacon in to render. He set the small enamelled coffee pot beside it. He stood with his hands held just above the warming barrel, palms down, and the heat rose into them and travelled up through his wrists and into his shoulders and his neck, and finally into his face, and for a few seconds the cold lost its purchase on him, and he allowed himself to feel something that was not quite peace, but was at least the shape of peace remembered. Smoky lay on her wool blanket beside the bench, her amber eyes half closed, her ears tracking the small sounds of the morning. He had built this stove for one reason. He had built it because he had spent 3 winters sleeping in his truck after the divorce, and he had learned in those winters what it meant to be cold all the way through, cold in a way that was no longer about temperature, but about how a man's body began to forget that warmth had ever been possible. He had promised himself, on the night he had finally found this half-acre and signed the papers, that he would never be cold like that again. He had built the rocket stove in the woodshed instead of the cabin, because if anything ever went wrong with it, a chimney fire, a creosote flare, a cracked fire brick that he did not catch in time, the loss would be the shed and not his home. A soldier built redundancy into everything. A soldier did not put all his survival in one room. He fed the fire. He turned the bacon. He poured boiling water into the speckled enamel mug and stirred in the cheap dark instant coffee that he had been drinking for 15 years. He carried the mug and the skillet out of the shed and back into the cabin, and he ate his breakfast at the small table by the window, and Smokey lay at his feet and accepted the strip of bacon he set down on the floor beside her, with the same dignified gratitude she always showed for any small thing. The wife had been called Renee. He did not say her name out loud any more. He had not said her name out loud in almost 3 years, but the name lived behind his teeth the way a piece of shrapnel lived in his thigh, unmoving and unmoved, pressing occasionally against a nerve, and reminding him that the body remembered everything the mind tried to forget. She had been 24 when he married her, and 28 when she had stopped writing letters during his second deployment, and she had been 31 and very tired-looking when he had come home the last time, on the long medical leave after the explosion that had taken Daniel Webb, and almost taken him, and she had told him through a tight, controlled, lawyer-coached voice that she could not do this any more. She had used the word "this" the way people did when they wanted to avoid using more honest words. She had not specified whether this was the war, or the homecomings, or the nights he could not sleep, or the silence at the breakfast table, or the man he had become who was not the man she had married. He had not begged. A man like him did not beg. He had signed what the lawyer told him to sign because the alternative was a fight he did not have the heart to fight, and because somewhere in the part of him that still believed in fairness, he had thought foolishly that the law would even things out at the end. The law had not. The house had been in her name. The savings had been moved during the 3rd deployment. The retirement account had been emptied into a fund he could no longer access. The pickup truck had been spared only because he had bought it outright, in cash with a re-enlistment bonus, and her lawyer had decided it was not worth the fight. He had walked out of the suburban Tacoma courthouse with his discharge papers, his wife's old wedding ring zipped into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket, because he could not yet bring himself to throw it into a river, and a German shepherd on a short leash who had refused to leave his side from the moment the army had decided she was unfit for further duty. He had driven east, he had slept in truck stops and rest areas and the occasional cheap motel when the weather got bad enough. He had eaten gas station coffee and granola bars and the canned stew he heated on a small camping stove in the bed of the truck. He had crossed Idaho and most of Montana before he had stopped, and he had stopped here, in Cold Creek, because the town had a single grocery store and a single hardware store and a feed mill that smelled of grain dust and oil, and because the road outside town climbed up into a valley where a half-acre with a tilting cabin and a collapsing shed was for sale at a price he could just barely afford. The realtor had been a tired-looking woman in her late 50s named Dolores, who had not asked him any questions she did not need the answers to. She had looked at his discharge papers, at the truck, at the dog, and she had simply nodded once and said, in a voice that contained no pity but a great deal of understanding, that the property had been on the market for almost a year and that the seller would take any cash offer. He had given her the cash. She had given him the keys that had been 22 months ago. He had spent the first month making the cabin habitable. He had spent the second month building the woodshed. He had spent the third month splitting and stacking the first cord of pine he would burn that winter. He had spent every month since seasoning more wood, working through the small, endless tasks that a half-acre asks of a man, and slowly, very slowly, allowing the half-acre to become something resembling a home. The truck on the road slowed down. Jax registered it before he heard it consciously, the way he registered most things as a small adjustment in the steady ambient noise of the morning. The engine note changed. The crunch of tires on gravel slowed. He raised his eyes from his coffee and looked through the window at the road that ran along the lower edge of his property, and he saw Howard Pemberton's silver pickup truck rolling at half-speed past his driveway. The councilman's head turned toward the woodshed where the thin, pale curl of wood smoke rose from the spark-arrested chimney into the grey morning sky. Pemberton shook his head. Slowly, the way a man shakes his head at something that personally offends him. Then he raised his foot off the brake and the truck rolled on toward town. Jax lifted his coffee mug and drank. Smokey lifted her head, looked at the road, looked at him, and lowered her head again. The radio on the kitchen counter, a small battery-powered unit that he kept tuned to the regional NOAA weather frequency more out of long habit than any particular need, murmured something about an approaching system out of the Gulf of Alaska. With sustained winds expected to reach 40 to 50 miles per hour by the end of the week, freezing rain transitioning to heavy snowfall, and the usual list of advisories that Cold Creek residents had heard 100 times before and would not, most of them, take seriously this time either. Jax listened. He filed the information. He did not react. He had been preparing for this storm, and the next one, and the one after that, since the day he had bought the property. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the mug in cold water from the pitcher. He wiped out the iron skillet with a clean cloth and set it on the back of the small wood stove. Then he took down the rifle from above the door, broke it open, confirmed that it was unloaded and cleaned the way it always was, and placed it back on the rack. The motion was not about hunting or threat. The motion was about the small daily ritual of touching the things that mattered, of confirming that the order of his world was where he had left it the night before. A truck passed on the highway a quarter-mile away and backfired once. Sharply, the report cracking across the cold air the way a rifle shot cracks across a valley. Jax went still. His body went still first, before his mind even had a chance to decide what the sound had been. His shoulders dropped into the slight forward roll he had learned to take cover with. His left hand drifted down toward his hip, where a sidearm had once lived. The breath left his chest in a long, controlled, almost soundless exhale. His pulse spiked and the world narrowed, and for a long, suspended fraction of a second the small cabin in Montana ceased to be the small cabin in Montana, and became instead a different room in a different country in a different year. A room where the air had tasted of dust and diesel, and where men he had loved had died at a distance of less than 10 feet from him. Smokey was already moving. She crossed the floor in 3 controlled strides, pressed her warm shoulder hard against the outside of his right thigh, and remained there. She did not look up at him. She did not whine. She simply stood there, her body a steady warm anchor against the side of his leg, her great chest rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of a creature who was not afraid, and whose unafraidness was a kind of pulling tide. He breathed in for a count of 4. He held for a count of 4. He breathed out for a count of 4. He did this 6 times. The room slowly returned to itself. The walls became wood again. The window became frost again. The cabin became Montana again. He lowered his hand and rested it on the broad, warm dome of Smokey's skull. "Good girl," he said quietly. "I'm here." The dog leaned into his hand for one long beat and then stepped away. He sat back down at the table and finished his coffee. Later that morning he drove the truck into Cold Creek for supplies. He did this every Tuesday. He did this on Tuesdays because Tuesdays were the slowest day at the hardware store and the grocery, and a slow day meant fewer people, fewer eyes, fewer small social transactions that he had to navigate with a face that he had never quite remembered how to wear in civilian rooms. He bought rolled oats and dry beans and rice and powdered milk and salt. He bought another 5-pound box of wooden matches. He bought a coil of baling wire and a quart of 2-cycle oil and a gallon of kerosene for the lamps. He bought a sack of dry kibble for Smokey, the brand the pet store carried that had no fillers and that her old ribs handled well. He paid in cash. The grocery cashier was a young woman named May, with a small daughter she sometimes brought to work, and May had always treated Jax with the kind of brisk, uncomplicated warmth that he had learned was a rare and undervalued thing in a small town. She bagged his groceries, set the receipt carefully on top of the bag, and said, "You stay warm out there, Mr. Harlan. Storm's coming." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It is." He carried the bags out to the truck. In the parking lot, leaning against the tailgate of a much newer truck, and talking with a man Jax did not know, was Vance Cobb, the local contractor who had quoted Jax $3,000 to install a code-compliant wood stove in the cabin 2 summers ago, and who had taken Jax's polite refusal as a personal slight. Vance saw him crossing the parking lot and turned to his companion and said, in a voice loud enough to carry exactly as far as it was meant to carry, "There he is, the chimney guy. Built himself a Russian rocket out of a barrel and a brick." The other man laughed. Vance laughed too. "Tell you what, when his shack burns down this winter, don't say we didn't warn the man." Jax did not turn his head. He did not slow down. He loaded the bags into the bed of the truck, latched the tailgate, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. Smokey was waiting in the passenger seat. She did not look at the men in the parking lot. She looked at him. He started the engine. He pulled out onto Main Street. He drove home through the long, grey, lowering afternoon. By the time he turned into his driveway, the wind had picked up out of the west, and the first fine grains of snow were beginning to skitter sideways across the gravel. He spent the rest of the daylight splitting wood. He had 3 cords already seasoned and stacked under the eaves of the shed, but a soldier did not look at 3 cords and call it enough when a storm was coming. He worked methodically with the 8-pound maul, splitting rounds of lodgepole pine and ponderosa into halves, halves into quarters, quarters into eighths. The maul rose and fell in the steady, tireless rhythm of a man who had been doing the same motion for so many seasons that his body no longer required his mind to participate. His breath plumed, his shoulders ached, his scarred hands, gloveless inside the leatherwork mitts, warmed from the work. The wood rang with the clean, dry sound of well-seasoned pine, the sound that told him every piece would burn hot and clean when its turn came. Smokey lay on the porch and watched him. By the time the western sky had darkened from pewter to charcoal, and the first hard flakes of snow had begun to fall in earnest, he had added another quarter cord to the stack under the eaves. He set down the maul. He carried the last armload of split wood into the shed, and laid it carefully in the dry bin beside the rocket stove. He stood for a moment in the doorway of the shed and looked at the warm orange glow of the fire he had banked low for the night, the soft tick of the thermal bench, the patient breath of the small room he had built with his own scarred hands. Then he closed the shed door, latched it, and walked back through the falling snow to the cabin. Smokey walked beside him. The cabin was warm. The wood stove ticked. The kettle was on. Outside, the wind began to rise into the long, low howl that he knew from 22 months of Montana winters, meant that the storm was no longer approaching. The storm had arrived. He did not yet know that the storm would not leave for 6 weeks. He did not yet know that a young woman in a small farmhouse a quarter-mile down his road was, at that moment, lighting the last of her propane stove burners and rationing the last of her son's albuterol. He did not yet know that the boy she was tending was 8 years old and had been raised on bedtime stories about a soldier named Jax and a dog named Smokey who his father had said were the bravest he had ever known. He knew only that the wind had risen, that the wood was stacked, that the stove was banked, and that the dog at his side was breathing slow and even. He sat down at the table by the window. Smokey lay at his feet. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest. The first night of the storm, the wind came down out of the high passes the way a freight train comes down out of a tunnel, full-throated and unannounced and indifferent to anything in its path. It rattled the tin roof of the woodshed. It pressed against the south wall of the cabin until the timbers complained in a low, woody chorus of settling stresses. It drove the snow horizontally across the half-acre sheets of it until the porch railings disappeared and the truck became a long pale shape under a smooth dune, and the line of black pine at the back of the property turned into a single wall of moving white. Inside the cabin, Jack sat at the table with the radio turned low and listened to the world rearrange itself. The Noah voice on the radio was calm in the way that Noah voices were always calm, the calm of a man reading a list of names at a memorial, a calm that knew its job was to deliver the truth at a temperature low enough for the human ear to absorb. The voice said that a low-pressure system out of the Gulf of Alaska had collided with an Arctic mass coming down out of Canada, that the resulting storm was now stationary over western Montana, and that residents of Sanders, Lincoln, Mineral, and Lake counties should expect sustained winds of 40 to 55 miles per hour, gusts to 70, snowfall in excess of 30 inches over the next 48 hours, and significant icing on power lines and tree limbs. The voice said that anyone who could shelter in place should shelter in place. The voice did not say anything that Jax did not already know. He had filled the 4 5-gallon jugs of water from the hand pump at noon. He had brought in 3 days of split wood and stacked it inside the cabin door against the wall. He had brought the kerosene lamps down from the high shelf, trimmed the wicks and filled the reservoirs. He had checked the small wood stove's flue for any creosote build-up he might have missed in his weekly inspection. He had laid out his cold weather gear by the door, the heavy canvas insulated coat, the wool watch cap, the lined leather gauntlets, the snow gaiters. He had checked that the truck's engine block heater cord was unplugged and coiled, since the power would soon not matter anyway. He had moved the small first aid kit from the truck cab into the cabin. He had set Smokey's wool blanket near the wood stove. He had made a small pot of beef stew on the cabin stove and eaten it with the dog at his feet. He had done these things the way another man, in another life, might have set out a tablecloth for a dinner party. With care, with a certain quiet pride, with the knowledge that a man's preparations are a kind of love letter to the people who would, later, be made safe by them. The radio crackled at 8 that evening with a regional emergency announcement. Northwest Energy was reporting transmission line damage in 3 counties. Crews could not be deployed until the wind dropped below sustained 60 miles per hour. Restoration estimates were not yet available. Customers were advised to prepare for outages of indefinite duration. 20 minutes later, the lights flickered. Jax was sitting at the table with a paperback novel he had been reading in 5-page increments for almost a month, and the small overhead bulb above the table dimmed once, brightened, dimmed again, and then went out. The cabin fell into the soft, pulsing red glow of the wood stove and the quiet hiss of the wind. The kettle clicked once as the iron began to cool from its previous boil. The refrigerator, an old apartment-sized unit he had picked up at a thrift store in Missoula, fell silent for the first time in 22 months. He waited for the lights to come back on. They did not. He set the paperback face down on the table and stood. He moved to the window beside the door and looked out across the half-acre toward the highway and the valley beyond. The valley was dark. In 22 months he had never seen it dark. There were always at least 3 or 4 porch lights visible from his window. The Loomis place a half-mile to the south, the Jenkins farm down by the river bend, the street light at the highway turnoff, and the warm yellow square of the Webb farmhouse a 1/4 mile to the north. All 4 lights were gone. The valley was a single black bowl beneath a sky of moving white, and the only light visible anywhere in it was the soft red breath of his own wood stove on his own window. Smokey came to stand beside him. She put her front paws on the windowsill and pressed her cold nose to the glass. She looked very specifically at the place a 1/4 mile up the road where the Webb farmhouse should have been visible. She held that gaze for a long minute. Her ears were pricked all the way forward. Her shoulders were tight in the particular way they tightened when she had made a decision he had not yet been informed of. Jax looked at her. "What is it?" "Girl." The dog did not turn her head. She kept looking up the road. He had seen the woman who lived in the Webb farmhouse twice in 22 months. The first time had been at the post office in Cold Creek, perhaps a year ago. She had been ahead of him in line, mailing a thin package, a small boy holding the back of her coat. She had been in her early 30s, maybe slightly younger, with a chestnut braid down her back, and the kind of guarded, deliberate face that he recognized the way one recognizes one's own reflection in an unfamiliar mirror. She had not seen him. He had not introduced himself. He had paid for his stamps and walked out, and that had been that. The second time had been 3 months ago. In early August, he had been driving past the Webb farmhouse on his way back from the feed mill, and he had seen her in the front yard, hanging laundry on a wash line strung between 2 old apple trees. The boy had been digging in the dirt beside her with a plastic shovel. She had raised one hand in a small wave as his truck passed. He had raised one hand in return. He had not stopped. He had not learned her name. He had not asked anyone in town who she was, because asking in Cold Creek was the same as advertising, and Jax had spent 2 years carefully not advertising. He knew only what the cashier at the grocery had once mentioned in passing, the way May mentioned things, never with malice and never with much detail. She had said, that day, that the young Webb woman had moved up from somewhere down south after losing her husband. She had said the little boy had asthma and that the country air seemed to be helping him. She had said it the way one said something kind about a stranger one wanted to be kind to, and Jax had nodded once and paid for his groceries and not asked any further questions, because asking further questions was not a thing he did. He looked at the dark place where the Webb farmhouse should be. He looked at Smokey. The dog was still watching the road. "All right," he said quietly. "I see it." He turned back into the cabin. He picked up one of the kerosene lamps, lit the wick, and adjusted the flame down to a steady amber glow. He set the lamp on the table. He went to the small chest of drawers beside the cot and opened the second drawer and took out his cold weather pack, a small canvas shoulder bag containing a flashlight with fresh batteries, a reserve set of batteries in a waterproof tin, 3 protein bars, a thermos of hot water that he refilled and rotated every morning, a length of nylon cord, a folding knife, a fire starter, and a small foil emergency blanket. The pack had lived in that drawer for 22 months. He had refreshed its contents on the first day of every month. He had never once until this night had any concrete reason to use it. He sat down on the edge of the cot and laced his combat boots tight. He pulled the second pair of wool socks over the first. He took down the heavy canvas insulated coat from its peg by the door. He pulled on the wool watch cap. He pulled on the lined leather gauntlets. He clipped the shoulder pack across his chest so that it would not swing. Smokey watched him assemble himself the way she had watched him assemble himself 1,000 times in a different country, in a different uniform, with different equipment but the same essential gravity. Her ears were forward. Her tail was still. Her breath was steady and slow. The radio on the counter crackled again. The NOAA voice said that the regional power outage now affected portions of 4 counties, that restoration estimates were still unavailable, that residents should not attempt to drive on county roads, and that the National Guard had been placed on standby but would not deploy until conditions improved. He turned the radio off. He took the lantern from the table and set it on the floor near the door so it would light his return. Then he stood with his hand on the door latch, and for one long moment he did not move. The cabin was warm. The cabin was prepared. The cabin contained everything he needed and everything Smokey needed to ride out a storm of any length the Montana sky cared to send. He had built this place precisely so that he would never again have to walk out of warmth into cold for any reason that was not strictly his own. He had earned this small, hard-won shelter. It was his. It was enough. The dog at his feet was looking up at him. Her amber eyes were endlessly steady, profound, ancient with that particular kind of canine, knowing that asked no questions and offered no judgment. She did not pull at the door, she did not whine. She simply waited, her great chest rising and falling, ready to follow him into whatever the next minute would require. Somewhere up the dark road, a young woman who had survived something he could only guess at was tending a sick child by candlelight in an unheated farmhouse. And she did not know yet that her power would not return for 6 weeks, and she did not know yet that a stranger she had waved to once across a hot August yard was about to walk into her life through a wall of horizontal snow, and she did not know yet that the dog at the stranger's heel had once belonged to a man who had loved her husband. Jax did not know any of this either. He knew only that Smokey was watching the road, and that Smokey did not watch anything without reason. "All right, soldier," he said. He lifted the latch. The wind hit the door before he had it fully open, slamming it back against his shoulder and sending a flurry of snow across the cabin floor. He braced and pushed forward, stepped out into the storm, and pulled the door closed behind him with both hands. The cold met him like an old enemy he had not quite remembered the size of. The wind drove the snow into his face and under the brim of his cap, and along the edge of his gauntlets where the canvas sleeves of the coat ended. He turned his head sideways to breathe, lowered his shoulder into the wind, and stepped off the porch into the white. Smokey moved out ahead of him with that low, steady, working trot she had used in 100 different countries on 100 different missions. Her body a dark shape against the white, her tail held level, her ears swiveling continuously to read a world he could no longer fully perceive. Jax followed her. The half-acre disappeared behind him within 10 yards. The road appeared beneath his boots only when he stepped onto it. The snow was already past his ankles and rising. The wind was a continuous animal that pushed at him from the left and tried to turn his shoulders. He kept his head down and his eyes on the dark moving shape of his dog, and he walked the quarter-mile north toward the place where the Webb farmhouse should be. The farmhouse appeared out of the white slowly, the way islands appear out of fog. There was no light in any window. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was only the dark, low, two-story shape of the building with the wash line still strung between the two old apple trees, the lines now hung with icicles instead of laundry. Jack stopped at the edge of what would, in summer, have been the front yard. He stood with the storm pulling at his coat and looked at the dark building. Smokey stopped beside him. She took 2 steps forward, toward the front porch. She stopped again. She looked back at him. Then, from somewhere inside the farmhouse, faint and muffled by walls and storm, came the sound of a child coughing. The cough was thin and tight and ended in the high, frightened wheeze of a small chest that could not pull air the way a small chest needed to. Smokey looked at him. Jax looked at the porch. He had walked a quarter-mile through a storm to confirm what his dog had already known, and now he was standing at the edge of someone else's yard with a decision he had not yet made. He lowered his shoulder again into the wind and started toward the porch. The porch boards groaned under the weight of his boots in a way that told him the whole front step had not been reshimmed in at least a decade. The screen door was missing entirely, leaving only the heavier inner door, and the inner door was a thin, hollow core thing painted a faded barn red that had blistered along the bottom seam from years of standing water. He raised one gauntleted fist and knocked, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, the way a soldier knocked on a strange door at midnight, loud enough to be heard, slow enough not to startle. He waited. Smokey stood on the top step a half-pace behind him. Her body angled slightly so that she could see both the door and the yard. Her tail level, her ears tracking the small sounds of the house through the larger howl of the storm. A faint movement of light passed across the small frosted window beside the door. A footstep approached from the inside, stopped, hesitated, and then came forward again. The door opened to the length of a security chain, and a single eye looked out at him through the gap. The eye was pale grey-green and exhausted. "Yes," she said. And her voice was the voice of someone who had practiced for the last hour the careful, neutral tone of a woman alone in a dark house with a wheezing child and no power and no help. "Ma'am," Jack said. He kept his voice low and even and entirely empty of anything that might be heard as pressure. "My name is Jax Harlan. I live a quarter-mile south. I saw your house go dark. I came up to check on you." There was a long pause inside the door. "We're fine," she said. The voice was not quite steady on the word fine. "Ma'am, I have heat. I have hot food. I have space for you and your boy. The power isn't coming back tonight. The radio's saying it's going to be days at minimum." Another pause. "My son is sick," she said. I heard him through the door. The eye behind the chain shifted, looked past him, found the dark, steady shape of Smokey on the step behind him, and held there for a moment. Something in the woman's face softened in a way that Jax did not yet understand, and would not understand for almost 2 more weeks. "Wait," she said. The door closed. He heard the chain slide. The door opened again, this time fully, and she stood in the gap holding a candle in a battered tin holder. She was 30, he thought, or perhaps 31, with the chestnut braid he had seen at the post office a year ago, now half undone and falling around her face. She wore a heavy hand-knitted sweater that had been her husband's sleeves, pushed up to the elbows. Her hands were red-knuckled with cold, her eyes were the pale grey-green of frozen river water, and the skin beneath them was bruised from sleeplessness. She held the candle steady because she had practiced holding it steady. Behind her, in the dim red-gold light of the candle and the faint bluer light of a single battery lantern set on a kitchen counter, he could see a small boy wrapped in 3 blankets on a couch. his thin chest rising and falling in the sharp, shallow breaths of a child whose airway was not opening the way it was supposed to. "You're the man with the strange stove," she said. Not unkindly. Not kindly either. She said it the way a person said the name of a thing she had heard about but not yet placed in any clear category. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "They talk about you in town." "Yes, ma'am. I'm aware." A small, tired, almost smile moved at one corner of her mouth and disappeared. "My name is Sarah," she said. "Sarah Webb. That's my son Tucker." "Mr. Harlan," sir, the boy said from the couch in a thin voice, because his mother had taught him manners, and the manners did not stop because he could not breathe. "You can call me Jax." "Son," Jax said. The boy nodded once, and another wave of the wheeze took him, and he closed his eyes and rode it out the way. A boy of 8 rides out something that has been happening to him for most of his life. Sarah Webb watched her son. Then she looked at Jax. Then she looked at the doorway behind him at the storm. Then she looked at her son again. "How far is your place?" she said. "1/4 mile. I have a hand-built sled in the woodshed. I can bring it back here in 15 minutes. We can take him on it. The dog can lead. You and I can walk on either side." "You walked here through this," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She drew a slow breath. Her eyes moved over him the way a woman who had been alone with a sick child in a powerless house in a storm assessed a strange man at her door, top to bottom, careful, clear-eyed. He let her do it. He did not move and he did not speak. He understood the assessment. He had assessed strangers in doorways too, in other countries with much higher stakes, and he respected the discipline of her attention. Whatever she was looking for, she found. "All right," she said. "Get your sled. We'll be ready when you come back." "Yes, ma'am." He turned away from the door and walked back into the storm. Smokey moved beside him. They covered the 1/4 mile in 12 minutes, the wind now slightly behind them, the snow thicker on the ground than it had been 30 minutes before. He went into the woodshed, took down the canvas-bedded toboggan he had built out of 2 seasoned ash runners and a sheet of heavy duck cloth lashed across them, and laid 2 wool blankets and the foil emergency blanket inside the canvas. He turned around and walked the 1/4 mile back. He made the round trip in under 30 minutes. Sarah had Tucker bundled in the boy's heaviest coat and a balaclava and 3 pairs of socks and his small winter boots by the time Jax returned. She had also, he saw, packed a small canvas duffel that contained, neatly arranged, the boy's nebulizer, a small propane canister, 2 inhalers, a glass jar of his prescription medications, 2 changes of clothes for both of them, a stuffed bear that the boy had clearly slept with for years, and a thin blue folder that she clutched against her chest, the way some people clutch their wallets, and others clutch their wedding bands. Jax did not ask what was in the folder. He understood the way a person carried the things that mattered most, and he understood not to look. He laid Tucker on the sled. He tucked the wool blankets around him. He laid the foil over the wool. He fastened the canvas flaps over the bundle. The boy's eyes, large and dark, and not unlike his mother's, watched Jax do this the way a small child watches an adult, he has decided, in the absence of evidence to trust. "You hold on tight to the rope inside." Son," Jax said. "I'm going to pull this real slow and steady. Your mama's going to walk on the right side. My dog Smokey is going to walk in front. We're going to take you home and get you warm. All right?" "Yes, sir," Tucker whispered. "Good man." Jax took the lead rope. Sarah took up her position on the right side of the sled with one mittened hand on the canvas. Smokey took the lead, 10 feet ahead, her body cutting the wind as best a body of her size could cut it. They walked the 1/4 mile back to Jax's half-acre in 25 minutes. Heads down, shoulders into the wind, the small boy on the sled, silent under his blankets, except for the thin, tight wheeze that came and went. By the time they reached the cabin door, the wind had increased another notch. The snow was past Jax's calves now and rising. He carried Tucker inside. He laid him on the cot under the window with his head propped on the rolled wool of Jax's spare blanket. He stoked the small wood stove. He brought the kettle back to a boil. He brought in the duffel and set it carefully on the table. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the cabin, the single room, the cot, the table, the small wood stove, the shelf of paperback books, the rifle on the rack above the door, the small framed photograph on the shelf above the cot, half hidden behind a tin of coffee, of a much younger Jax in a desert uniform with a younger, fully-eared, uninjured Smokey beside him. She did not let her eyes linger on the photograph. She let them pass over it the way a polite stranger lets her eyes pass over things in another person's home. "It's warm," she said. Her voice was thick with relief and with something else she had not given herself permission to feel until the door closed behind her. "It's so warm in here." "Yes, ma'am. I keep it warm." She lowered herself onto the wooden chair at the table and put her face in her hands and breathed for a long minute the way a person breathes when she has been holding her breath for an hour and a half without realizing it. Smokey walked across the cabin floor to the cot and lay down on the rug beside Tucker. The boy reached one small hand out from under the blanket and laid it on the broad, warm slope of her ribs. The dog accepted the hand the way she accepted everything, with that quiet, ancient gravity that asked for nothing in return. Jax made tea. He brought a steaming mug to Sarah. He brought a smaller mug, half water and half honey, to Tucker, and held it for the boy while he drank in tiny, careful sips between wheezes. The wind howled. The radio crackled. 20 minutes later, there was another knock at the door. Jax exchanged one look with Sarah, set down the mug, and went to the door with Smokey a half-pace behind him. He opened it. Howard Pemberton was on the porch. The councilman had aged 10 years in the 8 hours since Jax had seen his truck slow on the road that morning. His silver hair, normally combed back with a careful pomade, was wild beneath a ski cap that was clearly not his. His face was raw with cold. His wife Margaret was on his arm, bundled in a man's parka 2 sizes too large for her, her face pale in a way that Jax did not like the look of. Behind them, dim shapes against the white, were 2 more figures. An older man Jax recognized as Hank Loomis from the next half-mile down, and a woman who must have been Hank's wife Edna. Pemberton opened his mouth. Pemberton closed his mouth. Pemberton tried again. "Harlan," he said. The word came out hoarse. "Mr. Pemberton, Margaret's heart isn't doing well in the cold. We saw your smoke. We saw your light. We didn't know where else to go." Jax stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. Pemberton hesitated for one fraction of a second, and Jax saw, behind the hesitation, the entire architecture of every snide comment the man had ever made about him at every town meeting for the last 20 months collapsing in on itself in a slow, silent implosion. Then Pemberton lowered his head and shepherded his wife inside, and the Loomises followed, and Jax closed the door against the storm. Sarah looked up from the table. She looked at the new arrivals. She did not say anything. She moved her chair to make room. Jax moved the kettle back over the heat. He brought down 4 more mugs from the shelf. He brought the second wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the cot and draped it around Margaret Pemberton's shoulders and guided her down into Sarah's vacated chair. He did all of this without speaking because there was nothing in any of it that required words, and because words were a resource he had learnt to ration. He turned on the radio. The Noah voice, at a slightly different intonation now, the intonation of a man whose talking points had been updated, said that the regional outage had now expanded to portions of 6 counties, that the gas utility was reporting pressure failure in the Cold Creek Bonner Plains corridor due to compressor station icing, that repair crews would not deploy until weather cleared, that sustained winds were expected to remain above 60 miles per hour for at least the next 16 hours, that the National Guard was activating a winter weather response, but that no airlift assets could fly in current conditions, that residents in the affected area should shelter in place, conserve fuel, and check on neighbours when safely possible. "Jesus," Hank Loomis said softly. Pemberton said nothing. He was looking at his wife's face, and the things he was thinking were not for any other man in the room to see. Jax did the math in his head, the way a soldier does the math. 3 cords of wood seasoned, 1 cord more split that day, 8 bodies now in his cabin counting himself. kettle and wood stove and rocket stove sufficient for cooking and heating for an indefinite period if managed correctly. Food, rice, beans, oats, powdered milk, salt, the canned stew, the bacon, the coffee, 2 pounds of hard cheese, half a sack of flour, 2 pounds of dried apples, the kibble, water, the 4 jugs at the door, the hand pump outside as long as it did not freeze solid, the snow if it did, medicine, not his department, but the duffel at Sarah's feet and whatever the others had been able to carry. He had built a stockpile for 1 man and a dog. He was now responsible for 8 souls. He did not let any of this show in his face. "Mr. Loomis," he said, "would you and your wife mind taking the bench by the wall? Mr. Pemberton, your wife should stay in the chair by the stove. Mrs. Webb and her boy will keep the cot. I'll make some food. We're going to be in this for a while." Nobody argued. The cabin filled with the quiet, careful sound of strangers becoming, by force of weather and necessity, something more than strangers. The wind pressed against the south wall. The wood stove ticked. Smoky lay beside the cot with the boy's small hand on her ribs. And outside the cabin, in the woodshed 30 feet down the slope, the rocket stove that the town had laughed at for almost 2 years burned clean and hot and steady, throwing its long quiet warmth into the long thermal mass bench, holding the night at bay 1 cord at a time. By the morning of the 4th day, the storm had not so much passed as settled into a kind of permanent residence over the valley. The wind had dropped from its initial freight train roar to a constant low-grade groan that came in from the northwest in long, patient waves. The snow had stopped falling for whole hours at a time, and then, just when a person had begun to let himself believe that the worst was perhaps behind them, had begun again with a slow, malicious thoroughness that erased every clearing the men had cut from the porch to the woodshed in the previous afternoon. The temperature, according to the small mercury thermometer Jax kept nailed to the outside of the cabin window, had dropped to 17 below at 3 that morning, and had not yet, by 10, climbed back above 0. The cabin held 8 bodies, and the bodies held more bodies worth of presents. And presents, Jax had learned in 22 months of solitude, was a thing that filled a room far beyond the volumetric mathematics of arms and legs. Margaret Pemberton sat in the chair beside the wood stove with the second wool blanket around her shoulders and a slightly clammy colour in her face that worried Jax in a way he did not show. Her husband sat on a stool beside her, holding her hand and not letting go for hours at a time, and Howard Pemberton, who had stood in the parking lot of the Cold Creek hardware store on at least 4 occasions in the previous summer, making remarks about the homeless veteran with the rocket science chimney, did not look at Jax now in any way that contained any remnant of those remarks. He looked at his wife, he looked at the floor. Occasionally he looked at the small wood stove with an expression of religious astonishment that men of his temperament did not often allow on their faces. Hank Loomis and his wife Edna sat on the bench Jax had built into the south wall, the bench he had built for himself to sit on in the long summer evenings reading paperback novels with Smokey at his feet. Hank was 74 and had spent 41 of those years driving a logging truck out of Plains, and his face was carved into the deep weather cracks that men of that profession wore the way other men wore wedding rings. He spoke rarely and well. He had brought in the inside pocket of his coat a small worn King James Bible and a pair of reading glasses, and he read in silence for 2 or 3 hours at a stretch with Edna leaning against his shoulder. Edna had brought in the inside pocket of her coat a half-finished blue scarf on knitting needles, and she worked the needles in the quiet, patient rhythm of a woman who had knitted through every disaster of her 7 decades on this earth, and intended to knit through this one too. Sarah Webb sat on the cot beside her son for most of every day. Tucker's asthma was no better and no worse than it had been on the first night, which is to say it was bad, and he was managing it, and his mother was managing him, and the small propane canister that powered his nebulizer was being used at the absolute minimum frequency that Sarah could justify. The albuterol inhaler had 4 good days of light use left in it, by Jax's calculation, which he had performed the second night without telling her. After that, they would be running on the prednisone tablets and the boy's own thin chest, and whatever else the universe cared to provide. Jax slept in the woodshed. He did not announce that he was going to sleep in the woodshed. He simply, on the second night, rolled up his quilt and his pillow under one arm and walked out the cabin door and through the snow path he had cut down to the shed, and he laid the bedding on the long thermal mass bench beside the rocket stove, and he lay down on the bench with Smokey on the floor beside him, and that was where he slept for the rest of the storm. The bench held heat for 8 hours after a single firing. The bench was wide enough for a man to lie on. The shed was quiet. The shed contained no other breathing bodies. The shed did not require him to track 6 other people's small involuntary sounds while pretending, with the back half of his brain, to be asleep. He did not explain this to Sarah. He did not explain it to anyone. Sarah understood the second night. He saw her understand it as he was rolling up the quilt. She did not say anything. She only nodded once. Very small, the way a person nods who has herself slept many nights in places she did not want to sleep in for reasons she did not want to explain. He slept 4 hours at a stretch on the thermal bench, woke at 1 to feed the rocket stove, woke at 4 to feed it again, was up at 6 to start the day's first proper firing for cooking. Smokey slept on her wool blanket on the dirt floor beside him, and woke each time he woke, and watched him work each fire, and then lay down again. They had not slept this rhythm together since the desert. By day 5, the food required real management. He had inventoried everything on the third night with Sarah's help, while everyone else slept, the two of them at the cabin table by lantern light, writing numbers on the back of a paper grocery sack with a stub of pencil. He had calculated the calories per body per day at the lowest sustainable level, multiplied by 8, multiplied by an unknown number of remaining storm days, and arrived at numbers that meant they could feed 8 people on stew, oatmeal, beans, rice, and powdered milk for approximately 22 days, if no one became greedy and no one became weak. 22 days, Sarah had said, looking at the numbers. 22 days was a long time. Yes, ma'am, Jax had said. It was. Howard Pemberton noticed the thinning of the stew on day 6 and said nothing. He had stopped noticing things out loud somewhere on the second night, when he had watched Jax wrap a hot stone from the rocket stove in a kitchen towel and bring it up the path through the snow and slide it under Margaret's blanketed feet, and he had not made a single comment about anything anywhere since. The trigger, when it came, did not come from any of the things Jax had braced for. It came from a child. It was the 7th night. It was a few minutes after 2 in the morning. Jax had just fed the rocket stove and was lying on the thermal bench with one hand draped down to where Smokey's head pressed up against the canvas of the blanket. The wind outside had, for a few hours, dropped to almost nothing. The shed was warm and quiet. The fire ticked. Up the path. In the cabin, a child cried. It was not Tucker. Jax knew Tucker's wheeze and Tucker's cough and Tucker's small muffled sounds the way he had come in a week to know them. This was a different cry. It was Margaret Pemberton's, who had taken a turn for the worse that afternoon and had been moaning intermittently in her sleep. And the sound she made was not loud, but it was the sound of a small, frightened thing in a dark room a long way from home. It travelled across the 70 feet of snow between the cabin and the shed, and it slipped through the gap above the shed door, and it landed in the inside of Jax Harlan's ear, and the inside of Jax Harlan's ear sent it directly to the place in his brain that did not live in Montana. A village. A house with a yellow door. A woman in a doorway with her hand over her mouth, and a child, a very small child, perhaps 4 years old, in the corner of the room behind her, crying in exactly that thin, frightened, wordless register because of a thing that had just happened. A thing that Jax Harlan had been part of, a thing that Jax Harlan had not been able to undo, a thing that Jax Harlan had carried in a small locked cell at the very back of his mind for 9 years, and which was, at this particular moment in his Montana woodshed with a German shepherd at his feet, escaping the cell. His chest tightened around his lungs, his pulse climbed, the shed walls receded. The smell of the shed changed. The smell of the shed became the smell of a house with a yellow door, dust and diesel and copper and something else that he had spent 9 years pretending he could not name, and the wool blanket beneath him became a different blanket on a different floor, and he was, for one terrible suspended moment, no longer in the shed at all. Smokey was on the bench before he knew she had moved. She climbed up on the long thermal mass bench, which was a thing she had never done in her life because she was a working dog, and working dogs did not get on benches, and she pressed the entire length of her warm body against his side, her great head laid carefully across his sternum, her amber eyes inches from his, her breath slow and even and steady against his chin, and she did not whine, and she did not move, and she did not let him be alone. He breathed. He breathed in for a count of 4. He held for 4. He breathed out for 4. He did this for a long time, he did not know how long. The fire in the rocket stove burned. Smokey's chest rose and fell against his ribs. The wind outside dropped further. Somewhere in the cabin, Margaret Pemberton's cry stopped, soothed by her husband or by a passing shift of dream, and the night returned to itself. When he came back fully, when his hands were his hands again, and the shed was the shed again, and Montana was Montana again, he lay there for a long time with one hand on the dog's back, and one hand pressed flat against the warm wood of the thermal bench, anchoring himself in the texture of the things that were real. Easy. Soldier, he said, very softly, to the dog. I'm here. I'm here. Easy. She did not move. He did not sleep again that night. The 8th day, late in the afternoon, was the hardest hour of his war. It was not a cinematic moment, and it would not have looked like much to anyone watching from the outside, which was why he had to be alone for it. The cabin had become, over 8 days, a thing that the back half of his brain had begun to read as a hostile environment. 8 bodies, the smells, the unpredictable sounds, the constant micro-adjustments of children and elderly people in a small enclosed space, Margaret's laboured breathing, Tucker's wheeze, the radio's intermittent crackle, the wind outside, the tick of the wood stove, the small sound of Edna's knitting needles, which was by some private mechanism he could not explain. The worst of all of them because the click-click-click of the needles sounded, in certain hours, like the sound of a magazine being seated in a weapon. He went outside at 4:30 in the afternoon to bring more wood up to the cabin from the shed, and the cold air hit him at the door and he kept walking. He walked past the woodpile. He walked past the shed. He walked up the path he and Sarah had cut around the back of the property to dump the day's water from the snowmelt. He walked past the path. He walked into the line of black pine at the back of the half-acre, and he stood there in the snow, and he looked up at the cold, low sky, and he thought, very clearly, with no drama and no panic and no self-pity, that he could simply keep walking. He could walk into the timber. He could walk for an hour, maybe 2. He could find a place between 2 large trees where the snow had drifted soft. He could sit down. He could close his eyes. The cold would do the rest. It would be quiet. It would be done. The cabin would manage without him for the duration of the storm. There was enough wood. Sarah knew how to feed the rocket stove. He had taught her on the 2nd day. The boy would survive. The boy had a mother. The boy had a name. The boy had, somewhere under a duffel bag, a stuffed bear. There were people in the cabin who loved each other. There were people in the cabin who had earned a future. He was not, strictly speaking, one of them. He stood in the snow at the edge of the timber for what may have been 10 minutes or 20. The pine boughs above him were heavy with snow. The cold pressed in against the canvas of his coat, he thought, with the calm precision of a man considering a logistical problem, about how many steps he would have to take into the timber before any of them could find him. Smokey came up behind him through the snow. He did not hear her. He did not know how she had gotten out of the shed. She had been on the wool blanket beside the rocket stove when he had walked past. He had not opened the shed door. The door must not have latched fully when he had last fed the stove. None of these mechanical details mattered. What mattered was that she was there, beside his right knee, her warm shoulder pressed hard against the outside of his thigh, her amber eyes turned up to his face with the same endless steady knowing that she had brought to his cot for 22 months, and to the shed bench at 2 in the morning the night before. She did not pull at him. She did not whine. She did not bark. She simply stood there, her chest rising and falling at the slow, patient cadence of a creature who was not going anywhere without him. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "You can't follow me where I was thinking of going." "Soldier," he said quietly. She blinked at him once. "I know," he said. He stood there for another long minute. Then he reached down with one gauntleted hand and laid it on the broad, warm dome of her skull, and she leaned the full weight of her head into his palm, and for one long moment he felt, through the leather and the wool and the cold, the absolute and uncompromising fact of her aliveness. The heartbeat under the fur, the breath moving through the long ribs, the working dog who had bled on the same foreign soil he had bled on, who had walked off that soil because she had refused to walk off without him. He turned around. He walked back through the timber, through the path, past the shed, up to the cabin door. Smokey walked beside him with the patient discipline of a soldier who had brought her man back from the wire and who would never, for the rest of her natural life, speak of it to anyone. He went inside. He stoked the wood stove. He helped Sarah fold a blanket around Tucker that had slipped during a coughing fit. He carried the empty water bucket down to the shed for refilling. No one in the cabin knew what he had thought. In the timber, at 4:30 in the afternoon on the 8th day of the storm. No one, that is, except the dog. The 14th night of the storm was the night Tucker's chest gave out. It had been a slow degradation, the way a slow degradation always was, almost imperceptible from 1 hour to the next, but unmistakable across days. The boy had run through his albuterol inhaler on the 11th day. He had been on prednisone tablets cut into halves and quarters since the propane canister for the nebulizer had been emptied that afternoon. Sarah had spent the latter half of the day on the cot with him, propping him upright against pillows, applying a damp, warm cloth to his forehead, rubbing slow circles between his small shoulder blades, doing the small constant work that a mother did when there was no other work left to do. Jax had kept the cabin at a steady 72 degrees with a careful hand on the wood stove, and had carried up 4 hot stones from the rocket stove, wrapped in flannel, and had slid them in along the boy's feet and ribs to keep his core temperature up without crowding him, with blankets that he could not breathe under. By 11 o'clock that night the boy's wheeze had climbed to a register that Jax did not like. Sarah did not like it either. Her face, in the orange light of the kerosene lamp, had become the face of a woman who was no longer afraid of what could happen, but of what was happening. The cabin was full, in the way the cabin had been full for 2 weeks. Margaret Pemberton dozed in the chair, slightly improved over the previous days, but still pale. Howard sat beside her, holding her hand in both of his, and watching the boy on the cot with an expression that Jax recognized as the expression of a man whose interior was rearranging itself in real time. The Loomises were on the bench against the south wall. Edna had set her knitting down. Hank had set his Bible down. Both of them watched the boy. Jax stood by the door for a long minute and felt the cabin pressing in on him from all sides. The smell of wood smoke and wet wool and propane and cooked beans and tired bodies, the small involuntary sounds, the boy's wheeze, he felt the familiar tightening at the back of his throat that meant the back half of his brain had begun making lists of exits. He spoke to Sarah quietly. "I'm going to bring up another stone. I'll be in the shed." She looked up at him. Her grey-green eyes met his, and for a second she saw what was happening to him. He saw her see it. He saw her decide not to ask him to stay. "All right," she said. He stepped into his coat. He stepped into his boots. He took the lantern from the hook by the door. He stepped out into the night. The night was, by the standards of the previous fortnight, almost gentle. The wind had dropped to a low patient breath out of the northwest. The snow had stopped sometime in the late afternoon and had not resumed. Above the half-acre the cloud had thinned in places, and through the thin places a single ragged star showed, which was the first star Jax had seen in 14 nights. The cold was the deepest it had been all storm, somewhere below 25, below by the thermometer at the window. But the cold was a quiet cold, a pure cold, a cold that lived in the bones of the world and made the air taste like a clean blade. He walked the path down to the shed. The path had been cut and recut so many times that it now ran like a small canyon between waist-high walls of packed snow. The lantern in his hand threw a small soft circle of yellow light ahead of his boots. Somewhere out beyond the line of black pine, An owl called once, low and long. Somewhere further out, a coyote answered. He pushed open the shed door and stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The shed was warm. It was the kind of warm that a man could feel in his sinuses and in the small bones of his hands within the first 3 seconds. The rocket stove burned low and clean in the corner, its barrel ticking gently as it shed heat into the room and through the long thermal mass bench that ran along the wall. The kettle on the cooktop ring breathed out a thin curl of steam. The wood stack beside the door was waist-high with split pine and birch. The smell in the shed was the smell of clean-burning wood and old canvas, and the faint lanolin of the wool blanket on the bench. There was no smell of bodies, there was no smell of fear, there was no sound of children. Smokey was already there. She lay on her wool blanket on the dirt floor beside the bench, her great head on her front paws, her amber eyes already on him as the door closed. She had been there since dinner. She had lifted her head as he had stepped out of the cabin and had walked down the path beside him without his having to call her, and she had pushed open the shed door with her shoulder ahead of him in the way she sometimes did when the latch was loose and she had taken her place on the blanket, and now she watched him. Jax set the lantern on the workbench. He took off his gauntlets and laid them on the bench. He lowered himself onto the long thermal mass bench beside the stove and let his back rest against the warm cob wall, and he sat there with his hands held just above the steel barrel and felt the heat travel up into his palms and into his wrists and into his shoulders. He breathed in for a count of 4. He held for 4. He breathed out for 4. He did this 6 times. The cabin receded from the inside of his chest. The night returned to its proper size around him. The shed door creaked open. He looked up. He had not heard footsteps. He had not heard the latch. Tucker Webb stood in the doorway. The boy was wrapped in his hand-knitted afghan, which Sarah had bundled around him over his pyjamas. He wore his small winter boots, untied. His face was very pale. His chestnut hair was damp with sweat at the forehead. His pale grey-green eyes, his mother's eyes, looked enormous in the thin face. His chest beneath the afghan rose and fell with the tight, shallow, audible work of a small lung trying very hard. "Hello, son," Jax said softly. "Does your mama know where you are?" "She fell asleep," Tucker said. His voice was thin and a little hoarse and entirely matter-of-fact. "She was holding my hand and her hand got loose. I came to see your fire." "All right. Come in. Close the door." The boy used both his hands to pull the heavy door closed behind him. Then he turned. He took 2 steps into the shed. He stopped. His eyes moved past Jax, past the rocket stove, past the workbench, and landed on the dog on the wool blanket. His face changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the small, quiet, specific change that a face makes when a person has just recognized someone. The small softening at the corners of the mouth, the small widening at the eyes, the very small forward tilt of the head. "Hi, Smokey," the boy said. Jax went still. The dog lifted her head from her paws. Her amber eyes moved from Jax to the boy. Her thick double tail thumped softly, exactly twice, against the wool blanket. The boy walked across the dirt floor of the shed, his small boots scuffing softly, and he lowered himself to a crouch beside her. He held out one small mittened hand, palm down. The dog lowered her muzzle to his hand. She breathed in slowly, the way she had been trained to breathe in 1,000 other times, in 1,000 other rooms, in front of 1,000 other strangers, and then she pressed her nose very gently against the boy's knuckles. The boy laid his other small hand on the broad, warm slope of her shoulder and rested it there. "Hello, Smokey," he said again. Jax found his voice. "Tucker. How do you know her name?" The boy did not look up from the dog. He stroked her shoulder, very softly, with slow, careful strokes that had the rhythm of a child who had been carefully taught how to handle an animal he respected. "My daddy told me about her," he said. The wood in the rocket stove popped once, a small, clean snap. and a single ember rose in the burn tunnel and brightened and dimmed. "Your daddy?" Jack said. "Yes, sir. My daddy told me lots of stories about her. He said she was the bravest dog in the whole world. He said she could hear people thinking. He said when he was scared in the desert, he would look at Smokey and he would not be scared anymore." The boy paused. Smokey's amber eyes tracked the small, careful strokes of his hand, then closed, and her great chest rose and fell at the slow, patient cadence of a working dog who had been waiting 14 nights for this exact small hand to find her shoulder. "He said she had a man," the boy said. "He said she had a soldier. He said the soldier's name was Jax." The shed went very, very quiet. Jax could hear his own heart in his own ears. He could hear the small, even breath of the dog. He could hear the soft hiss of the rocket stove. He could hear, far out beyond the timber, the long, low call of the owl again. "Tucker," he said. He kept his voice perfectly steady because it was the only thing left of him that was, "Tucker, what was your daddy's name?" The boy stroked the dog's shoulder. "Sergeant Daniel Webb," he said, but Mummy called him Danny. The shed walls receded. Jack sat very still on the thermal mass bench, with his back against the warm cob wall, and his hands held just above the steel barrel of the rocket stove, and he closed his eyes for a count of perhaps 3 full breaths, because if he had not closed them, he would not have been able to keep his face the shape his face needed to be in for the small boy in the Afghan on the dirt floor of his woodshed. A patrol, 9 years ago. A village on the southern edge of a province whose name he no longer let himself say. A house with a yellow door. No, that was a different memory. That was not this one. That one stayed in its cell. This memory was different. This memory was a dirt road outside the village. This memory was a culvert under the dirt road. This memory was Daniel Webb 15 feet ahead of him on the road, and the dog Smokey on point 10 feet ahead of Daniel. And Daniel turning his head once over his shoulder and grinning at Jax through the dust on his face, the white teeth and the small chip in the front incisor that his wife always teased him about. And then the world becoming a single white sound and a single hard wave of pressure, and then dirt in his teeth, and then his ears not working, and then crawling through the dust to where Daniel had been, and then finding Daniel, and then carrying out of that village what could be carried out, and then the long drive to the field hospital, and then the long flight to the better hospital, and then the slow 20-month fight to bring Smokey home with him because Smokey had taken the lower fragment of the second blast in her left hindquarter and had survived the surgery and had been declared unfit for further duty, and the army had been entirely prepared to euthanize her until Jax had refused, calmly and quietly and in writing, in a way that had eventually, after a long bureaucratic battle, ended with her discharge papers stapled to his. He had carried Daniel Webb's helmet back from that culvert. He had not carried Daniel Webb. There had not been enough of Daniel Webb to carry. Jax opened his eyes. The small boy in the Afghan was still stroking Smokey's shoulder. The boy's wheeze was as bad as it had been in the cabin. The boy's small chest still laboured. Smokey lifted her great head off her paws. She turned her amber eyes from the boy to Jax, then back to the boy. She rose slowly, the way an old soldier rises, with controlled, measured grace, and she walked the 4 steps from her wool blanket on the floor to where Tucker sat. She lowered her body to the dirt floor beside him, her long, warm flank against his thigh, and she settled there, her great head laid carefully across the boy's lap. The boy's small mittened hand found the broad dome of her skull. He laid it there. The dog began to breathe. She breathed slowly. She breathed deeply. She breathed at the long, patient, 6-second in 8-second out cadence of a working dog at rest. The boy's wheeze did not stop, but the boy's other hand rose slowly to lay flat against the broad warm slope of her ribs, where he could feel her chest rise and fall, and the boy closed his eyes, and the boy began, without anyone telling him to, without any prompting from any adult in the room, to match his small thin breaths to the slow patient breaths of the dog. 6 seconds in, 8 seconds out. 6 seconds in, 8 seconds out. The wheeze did not vanish, it loosened. It loosened the way a knot loosens when a careful hand works it slowly from a different angle. The boy's small chest stopped fighting the air and started accepting it. The shallow upper chest breathing dropped down into the diaphragm. The colour came back very slightly into his lips. Jax watched this from the thermal mass bench, and he did not move because he could not move. The lamp on the workbench threw soft yellow light over the boy and the dog. The rocket stove burned low. The kettle hissed. The shed held them in its warm wooden hands. The boy opened his eyes. He did not look up at Jax. He looked at the dog. He laid his cheek down very carefully on top of her great head, between her thick ears, and he closed his eyes again. Daddy said, he said softly, that if I ever got really scared, I should think about Smokey. He said she would come find me if she could. His small voice broke very slightly on the word find. He said she was a soldier dog. He said she had a job. He said her job was to help people who couldn't help themselves. The boy's hand kept moving, very slow, on the dome of the dog's skull. I think he was right, Tucker said. Jax could not speak. He could not speak for a long time. Smokey lay there with her head on the boy's lap and her flank against the boy's thigh and her amber eyes half closed, breathing the long, slow, patient breath of a working dog who had, after 14 nights of waiting, finally been given the assignment she had been built her whole life to carry out. The shed door opened. Sarah Webb stood in the doorway. She was wrapped in her husband's heavy hand-knitted sweater and a pair of Jax's spare wool socks. Her chestnut braid was half undone. Her grey-green eyes were the eyes of a mother who had woken from a fitful sleep with her hand suddenly empty and had searched the cabin and had seen the open door and had run without a coat through the snow down the path to the shed and had pushed the door open and had stopped. She did not move from the doorway. She looked at her son with his cheek pressed against the head of the German Shepherd. She looked at the German Shepherd. She looked at Jax on the thermal mass bench. The lamplight caught the side of her face. The cold air from the open door rolled in along the floor and hit the side of the rocket stove and rose. She did not move. Sarah, Jax said. Very softly. He had to clear his throat to make the word work. Close the door. He's all right. He's all right. She closed the door. She walked into the shed in her wool socks. She walked to the place where her son sat with the dog. She lowered herself very carefully to the dirt floor beside them. She did not touch Tucker. She did not interrupt. She put her own hand, her bare red-knuckled hand, on the broad warm slope of Smokey's ribs, beside her son's hand, and she held it there. She looked at Jax. "You're him," she said. Her voice was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Jax said. "You're the Jax he wrote about. The Jax in the letters." "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes filled. They did not spill. She did not let them spill. She closed them for a moment, and then she opened them again, and they were clear. In the way some women's eyes are clear after they have made a long and quiet decision. "He said you carried his helmet," she said. "He said you were the reason he came home twice before he didn't." Jax could not answer. She did not need him to. The boy slept against the dog's head. The dog breathed. The rocket stove burned. The shed held them all in its warm wooden hands. After a long time, Sarah spoke again, very quietly, so as not to wake her son. "I moved here 3 years ago," she said. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know your name was a name on a road outside Cold Creek. I just knew it was somewhere out west." He used to talk about somewhere out west. Your buddy Jax and his dog Smokey, and the way you wanted to live somewhere with Sky. She drew a slow breath. "I had to go somewhere with Sky. I couldn't stay where we'd been together. So I came here. So Tucker came here. So we came here." Jax found his voice. It was rough, but it was his. "Why didn't anyone tell you?" he said. "After. The pension. The benefits. Anything. They told me a lot of things. They didn't all turn out to be true. She lifted her chin slightly the way a woman lifts her chin when she has spent 3 years filling out forms in triplicate. There was a discrepancy in his deployment paperwork. A line item, I've been fighting it since the funeral. The pension comes some months, other months it doesn't. The first year I called the VA every Tuesday morning at 9. The second year I called every other Tuesday. This year I stopped calling on Tuesdays. Jax closed his eyes. Yeah, he said softly. Yeah. He had heard 1,000 variations of that story. He had been 1,000 variations of that story. He wrote about you, Jax, Sarah said. He wrote about you in every letter. He told Tucker stories about you and Smokey every night before he went the second time. He used to make up new ones when he ran out of real ones. She gave a small, broken half-laugh that was not really a laugh. He called Smokey a, quote, angel with teeth, unquote. Tucker has been waiting his whole life to meet her. The dog opened her amber eyes. She looked at Sarah. She closed them again. The boy slept. The shed held them. Jax sat on the thermal mass bench and let the tears come. Finally, after 9 years and 3 storms and a lifetime of standing at the back of rooms, and he let them roll down his face into his beard without wiping them away, because there was no longer any reason to wipe them away, because the room contained the only person on earth who already knew, and her hand was on his dog's ribs, and her son was breathing. The morning of the 15th day broke clear. It broke the way a Montana sky sometimes breaks after a long siege, with no apology and no fanfare, the cloud simply gone. The sun coming up over the ridge to the east in a single hard blade of yellow light that struck the snow on the half-acre and turned it briefly to a sheet of beaten gold. The temperature was still below 0, but the wind was gone. The world, for the first time in 15 mornings, was quiet. Jax stood on the cabin porch with a mug of coffee in both hands and watched the light come down across the valley. Smokey stood beside him, her amber eyes squinted slightly against the brightness, her thick coat steaming faintly in the cold. Inside the cabin, the others were beginning to stir. He could hear Hank Loomis stoking the wood stove. He could hear Margaret Pemberton's voice, weak but clearer than it had been in 3 days, asking her husband for water. Sarah came out onto the porch and stood beside him without speaking. She was wearing his spare wool watch cap and her husband's sweater. She did not have a mug. He handed her his. Tucker's still asleep, she said, after a long minute. Good. He needs it. He breathed slower last night than he has in 2 weeks. Yes, ma'am, I noticed. Smokey stayed with him. She does that. Sarah took a slow sip of his coffee. The steam rose between them in the cold, clean air. She did not give the mug back. He did not ask for it. The sound came at 11 that morning. It was a sound the valley had not heard in 15 days, a sound that took Jax 3 full seconds to identify because his ear had stopped expecting it. It was the sound of an engine, distant, working hard against snow and gradient, somewhere on the highway past the lower edge of his property. He stepped off the porch and walked through the snow to where he could see the road. A dark green snowcat was crawling up the highway from the south. It moved at perhaps 6 miles an hour. Behind it, in single file, came 2 snowmobiles painted white with red crosses on the cowls. Jax watched the convoy pass his driveway. Slow and stop. A figure in a heavy parka with a county sheriff's patch climbed down out of the snowcat and waded up his driveway with a clipboard in one mittened hand. Jax met him at the lower fence line. Smokey stood at his left knee. The deputy's name, according to his nameplate, was Reyes, and he was in his early 40s and had not slept in 3 days. Sir. Are you Mr. Harlan? Yes, sir. You got people sheltering at this address? Yes, sir. 5 guests. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. and Mrs. Loomis, Mrs. Webb and her son. The deputy ticked the names on his clipboard. County Social Services has cleared a clearing about 2 miles north for a medevac chopper this afternoon. Wind permitting. We are extracting all storm shelters in this corridor. Priority cases first. The deputy glanced past Jax toward the cabin. I'm told you've got an asthmatic juvenile and an elderly woman with cardiac issues. Both qualify priority. Yes, sir. The chopper'll take them down to the regional hospital in Missoula. They'll be evaluated. Family can ride with them. Jax considered this. He considered the chopper. He considered the 2-mile transport on a snowmobile, in the cold, of an 8-year-old boy whose chest had only loosened in the last 12 hours. Deputy Reyes, he said. What's the cabin altitude on that chopper? Sir, what altitude does it cruise at? Pressurized. It's not. It's a National Guard medevac. They fly low, maybe 2000 AGL. And what's the temperature in the cabin in flight? The deputy looked at him for a long second. Sir, it's a working medevac. It is not a hotel. Yes, sir. I understand. I'm asking because the boy has reactive airway disease. Cold air at altitude is going to set him back. He stabilized last night. I'd like to keep him stabilized. Reyes shifted his weight. He looked back at his clipboard. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Jax. Sir, the directive from county is to evacuate priority cases. Yes, sir. You're refusing the evacuation for the juvenile. I'm not refusing anything. I'm letting his mother make the call. I'd like her to have the information before she does. Behind Jax. The cabin door opened. Howard Pemberton came out onto the porch in his ski cap and his ill-fitting parka. He saw the snowcat. He saw the deputy. He waded down through the snow to stand at Jax's other shoulder. Deputy, Howard said. Mr. Pemberton. Your wife on that priority list as well? Yes. Howard cleared his throat. Yes, she is. We'll go. Margaret needs proper medical attention. Yes, sir. But, Howard paused. He looked at Jax. He looked back at the deputy. But not the boy. The boy is not going on that chopper. The boy is going to stay here with Mr. Harlan and his mother until the road is clear and we can drive him out properly in a heated truck. Reyes blinked. Sir, that's a county decision based on medical priority. It's a mother's decision based on her child, Howard Pemberton said. The voice was the voice Jax had not yet heard him use. The voice of a man speaking on behalf of someone else. The voice of a man who had spent 14 nights watching his wife breathe, and who had in those 14 nights learned something he had not previously known about how a person comes to other people's defense. I'm a councilman in Cold Creek. I know how this works. The boy is stable in this cabin. The boy is not stable in a windy helicopter at 2,000 feet. We're not putting him on it. He's staying here with Mr. Harlan. Reyes looked at Jax. Jax did not say anything. Reyes looked back at his clipboard. All right, Reyes said. He made a notation. I'll mark him as guardian refused at this address. Mrs. Webb will need to sign off. She'll sign, Howard said. She did. Sarah came out, read the form, signed it on the hood of the snowcat with the deputy's pen, and went back inside to wake Tucker and dress him for a long warm morning by the wood stove. The Pembertons gathered the small bag they had brought. Margaret was loaded into the snowcat with a careful gentleness that surprised Jax. Howard climbed in beside her. Before the door closed, Howard turned and looked back at Jax through the open door, his weathered face unreadable for a long moment, and then he gave a single small nod. Jax returned it. The snowcat backed down the driveway, turned, and crawled away up the highway toward the clearing 2 miles north. The Loomises had elected to stay another 48 hours until the highway was clear enough for Hank to drive his own truck home. The cabin became, suddenly, less full. The radio that afternoon reported that the regional outage was not over. Northwest Energy crews were working the substation in Plains. Estimated restoration for Cold Creek and the surrounding valleys was a minimum of 6 more days, possibly longer. The gas utility was still down. Residents were urged to remain in shelter. The chopper had successfully extracted 9 priority cases from the corridor. There had been, the radio reported in the same flat NOAA voice, 2 deaths in Sanders County overnight, both of them elderly people whose homes had run out of fuel. Jax turned the radio off. He sat on the porch step that afternoon with his coffee and watched the sun cross the sky. Sarah brought Tucker out, wrapped in his Afghan, and the boy sat on the porch with him for almost an hour, his small mittened hand resting on the dome of Smokey's skull, his breath coming slow, and even at the long patient cadence of the dog beside him. The next 4 days were, by comparison to what had come before, almost gentle. The cabin held 3 people and a boy and a dog. The Loomises went home on the 17th day, when Hank's ploughed driveway was finally cleared by a county truck. The food stretched, the wood stretched, Sarah cooked, Jax split, Tucker improved day over day in the slow, steady arc of a child whose lungs were finally being given a chance. He spent his afternoons in the woodshed beside the rocket stove, sometimes with Jax, sometimes alone, learning the names of the parts of the stove from a small hand-bound notebook Jax had once sketched the design into. The notebook was 8 years old. The notebook had been begun in the desert. On the morning of the 21st day, the power flickered back on in Cold Creek proper. The Cold Creek Valley remained dark for another 4 days. On the 25th day, the lights came back to Jax's half-acre at 4:17 in the afternoon. Jax was in the shed when the cabin's small overhead bulb came on. Sarah inside called out, soft, surprised, "Jax, the light." He came up to the cabin door. He looked inside at the small, ordinary, electric light over the table. He nodded once. "All right," he said. He went back to the shed. The building inspector arrived 2 days later. He was not the same inspector who had come out 20 months earlier. This was a younger man, perhaps 35, with a county shirt and a clipboard, and the slightly defensive manner of a person who had been sent on an assignment he had not chosen. His name was Patel. He stood in Jax's driveway with his clipboard and read aloud from it. "Mr. Harlan, I have a complaint on file from the previous summer regarding an unpermitted solid fuel installation in an outbuilding on this property. I am here to inspect the installation and assess whether it meets county code or whether it must be removed." "Yes, sir," Jax said. "Could I see the installation?" "Yes, sir." He opened the shed door. Patel stepped inside. He stood for a long moment in the doorway. He took in the rocket stove. He took in the thermal mass bench. He took in the chimney. He took in the sheet of paper, taped to the wall above the workbench on which Jax had written, in neat block letters, the operating temperatures and burn times for various wood loads. He took in the wood stack. He took in the small notebook on the bench. "This is hand-built," he said. "Yes, sir." "You designed it?" "Yes, sir." "From a public domain plan I modified for this climate and this building footprint." "Are you a licensed builder?" "No, sir." "An engineer?" "No, sir." "Combat engineer training?" "Army." 10 years. Patel made a notation. He did not look up. "Sir, I'm afraid this installation is going to be cited. The county code requires solid fuel appliances to be UL listed and installed by a licensed contractor. There are also clearances issues, setbacks, chimney specifications." "Yes, sir. There will be a fine. The amount depends on whether you bring it into compliance or remove it." "Yes, sir." Patel turned to leave the shed. He stopped in the doorway. Sarah Webb was standing in front of him in the snow. She was holding Tucker against her hip. She was wearing her husband's sweater. Her grey-green eyes were very steady. "Sir," she said, her voice was clear and quiet and entirely without apology. "My son and I survived a 6-week storm in the cabin behind you. The Pembertons survived it. The Loomises survived it. The reason we are alive is the installation you're about to cite. There were people in this valley who were not as lucky as we were. I read about them on the radio. They died because they did not have something like what is in that shed. I would like that to be on the record before you write the citation." Patel looked at her. He looked at the boy. He looked back at the shed. He did not say anything. "My name is Sarah Webb," she said. "My late husband was Sergeant Daniel Webb, killed in action 9 years ago in Helmand. He served alongside Mr. Harlan. I would like that to be on the record as well. Patel cleared his throat. He looked at his clipboard. He looked back at the shed. A second engine came down the highway at that moment. Jax recognized it before it slowed. Howard Pemberton's silver pickup pulled into the driveway. Howard climbed out. Margaret was visible in the passenger seat, alive and sitting upright and looking better than she had looked in 3 weeks. Howard walked up to the group at the shed door. "Inspector Patel," he said. "Mr. Pemberton, I'd like to formally withdraw the complaint that brought you here today. The complaint was filed by me. I'm withdrawing it." Patel looked at him. "Sir, you can withdraw the complaint, but the violation is now on county record. I'm here. I have to act on it." "Then I'd like to pay the fine," Howard said. "And I'd like to engage a licensed contractor to bring the installation into full compliance. At my expense. You can issue the citation to me. I am the responsible party." "Sir, you're not the property owner." "Then issue it to him." Howard nodded at Jax. "And send me the bill." Patel stood there for a long moment. He looked at the 4 of them. He looked at the shed. He looked at his clipboard. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "I'm going to write this up as a courtesy notice rather than a citation, pending compliance work to be completed within 90 days. You'll need a permit. You'll need a licensed inspection. The installation on my preliminary review may actually meet most of the underlying code requirements with minor clearance modifications. I'll let the licensed inspector confirm." "Yes, sir," Jax said. "That's the most generous reading I'm able to offer." "Yes, sir. I appreciate it." Patel wrote the courtesy notice. He handed it to Jax. He nodded once to all of them and walked back to his county truck. Howard Pemberton watched him go. Then he turned to Jax. He held out his hand. Jax looked at it for a long second. Then he took it. The 2 men shook hands in the snow in front of the woodshed, and neither of them said anything. And there was nothing further that needed to be said. And, after a moment, Howard let go and walked back to his truck and drove his wife home. That evening, after Tucker had been put to bed on the cot and Sarah had banked the cabin wood stove for the night, and Jax had fed the rocket stove its last load, the 3 of them sat in the shed in the orange light. Sarah held the thin blue folder she had brought from her farmhouse on the first night, the folder she had clutched against her chest as if it were her own heart. "I want to read you something," she said. She opened the folder. The folder contained letters. Letters in handwriting Jax had not seen in 9 years, in pale blue ink on military stationery. Dozens of them, organized by date. She picked one. She held it in the lamplight. "This one is from his 2nd deployment," she said, 2 months before he died. She read. She read the letter slowly, her voice clear and steady. The letter was not a long letter. It was a letter from a young husband to his young wife about the small, ordinary things of his day, in a place very far from her. It was about the heat. It was about his squad. It was about a soccer game he had played with some local children at an outpost. And in the middle of the letter was a single paragraph that she read more slowly than the rest. "You know, Sarah," Daniel Webb had written, "there is a man in my squad who I would walk through fire for. His name is Jax Harlan. He doesn't say much. He doesn't ever ask for anything. He carries the heaviest pack, and he takes the worst watch, and he never complains. He has a dog named Smokey, who is the smartest creature I have ever met. They are not like a soldier and his dog. They are like one being in 2 bodies. I have seen that dog read a room of strangers in a way I have never seen any human read it. I have seen Jax do things on patrol that I will not write to you about. But I want you to know, if anything ever happens to me out here, and Tucker grows up without me, I want him to know that I served with a man like Jax Harlan. I want him to know that good men still exist. I want him to know what good looks like." Sarah's voice did not break. She finished the paragraph. She finished the letter. She folded it. She put it back in the folder. She looked at Jax across the orange glow of the rocket stove. Jax sat on the thermal mass bench with his back against the warm cob wall, and he looked at her and he could not speak. The tears that had come the night Tucker had said Smokey's name came again, slower this time, more quietly, and they ran down the lines of his weathered face into his beard, and he did not wipe them away. He was wrong about one thing, Sarah said softly. Tucker is growing up without him. But Tucker is not growing up without you. Smokey lay between them on her wool blanket. The fire burned. The night held them. Spring came late that year. The way spring always came late in Cold Creek. But it came. The snow on the half-acre receded in long brown patches. The line of black pine at the back of the property dropped its winter cones. The road frost lifted. The hand pump began to run free and clear after Jax greased the seal. On the first warm Saturday in April, Tucker Webb walked up Jax's driveway in his small mud boots with a piece of split pine in both hands. He set the piece on the splitting block beside the woodshed. He frowned at it. He frowned at the splitting wedge in his small fist. He frowned at them all. He looked up at Jax, who stood beside him with his coffee in both hands and Smokey lying in the new spring sun. "My daddy showed me how to start," Tucker said, "but he forgot some parts." Jax set down his coffee. He knelt beside the boy in the brown grass. He laid his scarred right hand over the boy's small mittened hand on the splitting wedge. "Your daddy showed you the start, son," he said quietly. "Let me show you the rest." The wedge came down clean. The pine split in two halves with a small bright sound. Tucker laughed. It was the first time Jax had ever heard him laugh. Smokey's tail thumped. Exactly twice. In the spring grass. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.